Thank you very much for coming. My first episode in Tremor was, I think it was 1971 or 1972, when I got a job as a barman in the Grand Hotel. And I didn't know how to pull a pint. And so reading Michael's novel was amazing because I was getting flashbacks of those moments when you're in a bar and there's someone watching you who knows how to pull a pint and you don't know. And he wants to show you you'll never know. And there are three people looking for different massive orders. And it's coming up to closing time. There used to be an extension until 2 a.m. in the Grand Hotel at that time. But anyway, Michael, I wonder if you could just start by reading us. You said maybe the opening of the book, just to get a sense of its sound.
For sure. Thank you so much. Thanks for being here. I'll just read the first page or two just to give you a bit of a flavour for what it is that you're in for, I guess. There was nothing to it. I swung and hit him and he dropped. A girl came flying forward and pushed me. What'd you do that for? The lad was lying there and I was standing over him and there were people all around me making noise. By the time I got away from the tussle, 2 Land Rovers had pulled up. A jaded-looking peeler with a receding hairline came towards me. Is that blood? He said, pointing to a stain on my shirt that could have been anything. He took my name and number and told me he would be in touch. I held my hands up and said that was no problem. He came at me, I said. I didn't know what to do. At the top of the street, the lad was put on a stretcher and the stretcher was heaved into the back of an ambulance. I think it's best you make your way home, the peeler said. I decided he was a good peeler, a helpful peeler. We'll be in touch, he said, and I thanked him. Thanks very much, I said. Back at the flat, Brian had his phone in his face and was pacing up and down the living room looking for a party. But it was 5 o'clock in the morning and the birds were out. He pulled the blinds closed as if that would help and nearly took the window with him, the brightness. I grabbed the purple throw my ma had given us as a moving in present and pulled it over my head. I lay with my head on the pillow and stared through the space between the empty bottles. Ryan checked the fridge, the cupboard next to the fridge. He lifted a can from the counter and gave it a shake. I give up, I said. Give up? You haven't done fuck all. I'm going to bed. Fuck's sake, Sean, don't be leaving me hanging here. I'm not leaving you anywhere. I'm in the next room. Bounce into my bed, sure. We'll watch a film. We need to stop doing this. Doing what? Come on. The window above the bed was open and the breeze wafted through. I stripped down to my boxers and climbed under the covers, but stayed on the outside so I could creep into my own bed as soon as Ryan passed out. The wall was black with mould and it made the room smell damp. There were clothes all over the place, takeaway cartons, cups and glasses and empty cans. Ryan smoked too much weed. That's what it was. It made him lazy. It made him not give a bollocks. I said to him, you smoke too much of that shit, and took the spliff off him. He didn't care. He was sinking into it nicely. And he had his favourite film on, The Shawshank Redemption. He made me watch it every time we ended up like this. It gave him hope. Watch this, he said. It was that scene he loved, the one where Andy Dufresne arrives at the penitentiary and all the inmates are going mad, screaming at him, calling him and the rest of the newcomers fresh fish. I didn't think much of Andy the first time I laid eyes on him. That was Ryan's favourite line. He thought it was brilliant. I did too. Never judge a book by its cover. That's what that means. Never judge anybody, because you never know.
Hey, that's really good. Did you make the audiobook?
No.
What's interesting there is that you're using a certain voice, and it's very controlled, clipped sentences. The dialogue has texture, flavor, local moments, but the prose itself is pretty straightforward. The problem you have starting the book is that you have to have a figure who really has about 5 different sounds he makes. He talks in a different way to his mother, to his brother, to Anto, to his friends, to Mairead. He then has another sound, an almost literary sound, which belongs to him. Now, how do you play that? I mean, how do you work those sounds against each other?
Well, with great difficulty. I think that was one of the things that was probably. There was a distance that I kind of needed to get right. I knew that I had to close that distance. That in my head, I wanted the reader to experience the world immediately in terms of like how Sean experiences it. Almost that you're moving through the world as he moves through it. And language is so much part of that and how he interacts with different people, also because the book is about how he behaves differently in different spaces, depending on where he is, his group of friends, his family, university people. And so these adjustments in speech were very important for that. The difficulty I think came with, at one point I sort of had, because I wrote this book as part of a PhD, and so much part of that PhD was, it was a creative writing PhD, but there was a theoretical sort of component to it. And I was sort of acquiring all this language that I didn't have before, a theoretical language that I was kind of engaged in while writing the book. And the language kept sort of finding its way into the prose in ways that was destabilizing in all sorts of ways, because Sean's at a very particular moment in his life. He's acquired a degree for sure and returned to Belfast, but he's also got so much, there's so much parts within himself that are still attached to the person he was. He's kind of stuck in this kind of half-transitory period in his life. So his language in that sense is like in tension with itself. So I was kind of always wrestling with that. I was wrestling with how much does he know, how articulate actually is he, and what moments do you use that articulacy or display it. A good guideline was that I sort of did the basic thing of, a post-it note, capital letters, don't write anything Sean wouldn't say, and that sort of kept me right.
Yeah.
Because what often happened was that Sean, in particular moments, say while he's working, pulling pints, as we've all done at some point, he maybe sort of started ruminating in a way that he wouldn't have before, that he might have gone, God damn capitalism. Do you know?
Yeah, that his inner PhD could emerge.
For sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Marx. So there was this sort of balance to kind of strike. And I think that was a tricky kind of thing to maintain. But it also allowed me then to say things, at least in the moment. And it sort of allowed me to show how he behaves differently and depending on where he is. And that was really important for the book,
There are cities in the world that you could name them and say, I went to the graveyard there. And that would mean something. There are many cities that means nothing. But for example, in Dublin, once upon a time, it would have been Glasnevin or Arbor Hill. But Milltown Cemetery in Belfast has that. You could have one in Belgrade or in Zagreb, anywhere where there's recently been a set of the murdered dead, very, very, very close to each other, very close in time. The problem, again, I'm giving you the problem because there's a solution in this book, is how do you get your character into that place so that you can evoke the strangeness of a city having that space filled not with people who had died naturally, as it were, but begins to have a sort of, it isn't mystical, it is still an extraordinary power a graveyard that would have. So, you open with a fight. That should be enough. Then you think, well, and the PhD won't help you here. You're walking along the street, you're thinking, is there any way I can get this Sean into this graveyard every day? And the answer is yes, it's a thing. And it's new for me in fiction, community service, as a thing in a novel where you can move a character from the comfort zone of that moldy flat or the comfort zone of other places to actually open public space where he has to be every day. And there's a wonderful moment in that where you have the character, an old timer says to him, "Are any of your crowd buried here?" And the Sean character says, "Well, great grandparents maybe, but none of your recent." And he says, "No." And the guy says, "Well, you have all that to look forward to." And so you're getting not just the political thing, but another sort of darker thing. His grandmother is still alive. There's a sense of him as a very young man where this death has not hit him in that sort of, obvious way. But and then, of course, we realize later in the book that what was said to him that caused the fight, it's actually been held back from us because he's holding it back from himself almost. So I suppose there is a question. I promise there's a question, which is that this. Did this come over time? Did you get the first scene and then work out later what it could give you, the freedoms it could give you? Or did those three things, the fight, the community service, the cemetery, and finding out later what it was for, did all that come as a single piece of inspiration?
Difficult to say. I think I always knew that that was the outline of the story, that he was going to start. The punch, actually, the first lines of the book were the first lines I wrote and remain unchanged, really, actually, throughout the whole process of writing the book. Actually, probably the only part of the book that went unchanged.
Right.
And strangely, that was what I kept going back to when it came to writing the voice, was that because those opening lines contained something of the embryo of what I was trying to hit. And I hit it very instinctively in that way. I knew that the book was about a young man committing this assault, doing community service and going to Milltown Cemetery.
Right.
And that,
So you always had that?
I had that.
Yeah.
And so it was, what is everything else that comes with it, and who is this young man, and how has he arrived at this point in his life, and also what relationship does he have with himself and the act of violence that he's committed, in terms of why did he do it, and he is provoked, and you sort of learn that later on in the story. But there is then this kind of inner turmoil about whether or not he should have done what he did, or did what he did. And that's so much part of the process, I guess, of his movement or trajectory. And I think he sort of is exposed to himself in different ways by different people, I guess. And one of them is this Mairead figure, this childhood friend who kind of exposes him to another world. And that's kind of, there's a reaction to that. But the cemetery in and of itself is like a very symbolically rich place. I spent some time there myself in various ways. And I guess community service allowed me to explore it through the eyes of the people who were directly connected to it in all sorts of ways. And the character you referred to, Fra, is a kind of malignant presence. He's an older man, and he follows Sean around, asking him, "What are you doing here?
Who's your father?"
Who's your father? Because that's the indicator for who you are, and speaks so much to who you are. And he is repressing all sorts of things about himself, about who his family are, and what has happened within his family. And so this question, or this challenge to him, I guess, causes some sort of cleave inside him,
I want to look at the word peeler, and that the first thing is, of course, that how do you translate the word peeler into French or into Spanish? In other words, the first choice is you're not going to explain slowly to a foreign reader or an outsider, the peeler, a local word for that you're not going to bother with that. You're going to get on with the book. The book is written in his voice. It's written for whoever reads it. But you're not going to start explaining Belfast. You're not going to say, this is after the Troubles, when the RUC had been disbanded and replaced. You're not going to start that.
Yeah.
But you're not going to call him a policeman, which might be the easiest way for a foreign reader to get who he is. So you call him a peeler. Yeah. But then you're not even explaining, this is, of course, the oh God, help me.
PSNI.
I was going to say PRSI. PSNI. Yeah,
You'd think there would be a royal in there, wouldn't you?
PSNI. The PSNI. It's after the Troubles, and that he's living in a world that has taken this so much for granted now that doesn't even impinge on him as he's going through the experience. This is a new sort of police force. He just calls him the peeler.
Just the peeler.
Yeah. But you're setting this in a Belfast which is meant to be free of violence, and in a way where those ghosts, in a way, have been. There's a hope that that at least the centre of Belfast has been in some way freed of all of this. But what you're doing is you're establishing that these things remain, and they remain in very strange, interesting ways, much more interesting for a novelist to work with than the actual Troubles themselves, because you're dealing with aftermath, ghosts, traces, and you're dealing also with a sort of enormous legacy and scars. But all of it is subtle. All of it happens in odd ways. So I think, is this true that it's easier to write this as a novelist, or it lends itself to the novel form much more than the actual day, than Bloody Friday, or the big days of car bombs, or you see, or British Army?
For sure. I guess, and I mean, that's the thing, is it's through language, and it's how people articulate this kind of thing, and how language is haunted in some way, as much as it is like a site of resistance or a site of contention, depending on what way you're using it. It is also haunted, and it has these associations that you kind of inherit in some way, you know. I didn't know that we called peelers because of Robert Peel, you know. I had no idea. But then I had to go to England and read from this book, and then I thought, I have to explain this, you know. And but
Hold on, you didn't know until when?
quite late,
Like when?
genuinely in my 20s, like when the book was published. Like,
What?
Honest to
You
God.
mean you wrote peeler just because that's the word you use, like cop?
'cause that
Like you
was
could
it.
write cop without knowing there was a man called Cop.
That was it. It was just like I hadn't even thought. Do you know?
Yeah, yeah.
And I had heard of Robert Peel. I knew who he was. The connection just wasn't made consciously.
Yeah.
Do you know?
Yeah.
So you inherit these idioms, you know,
Yeah.
and you use them in whatever way you
Yeah,
can,
yeah,
you know,
yeah.
as weapons as well as anything else. I think, and I guess like you know this. I'm sort of privileged in a way that I'm born when I was born when I was born in 1990, you know, which you know wasn't as tidy a time as people make it out to be during the Troubles. In fact, they were some of the worst years. But I have a distance that my parents in particular wouldn't be afforded, or that generation don't have in the same way. And that allows me then to think about it. And I think, particularly for me, I was thinking about it in terms of how my milieu or my generation had carried this or were affected by it indirectly through their parents in different ways. And how the place in and of itself kind of is a symbolic representation of that. And that what's painted on the walls, what memorials exist at the end of your street, how it's remembered or misremembered in various ways, you know. And I think that sort of finds its way into language naturally. In the way that I said peeler for 28 years of my life or whatever year, you know, and then made the connection. And I think so much part of the process of writing a book was confronting myself with these different realities, you know, and these different violences and questions of, you know, or contentions, I guess, you know.
Take me through the figure of Mairead, because she's the one who's really going to go to Berlin. Or she may go to Berlin, but the fact that he has to be a different person with her. You know, when he's with his brother, he's very good at melting into situations. But with her, it is as though there's a pressure on him to speak the truth or behave in a different way. And so therefore, every time she appears, there's almost a new tone comes in, as though she represents an exit or she represents the future.
For sure. She initially was actually quite a secondary character. Like she was just somebody who he was kind of sleeping with at the weekends, kind of thing. But she sort of did that thing that some people say that characters do and just grew. And I guess like during the process of writing the novel, I knew that I needed a function for her, or I couldn't. And I think the thing was I couldn't get him from where he was to where he had to go. Yeah. You know? Yeah. And so I thought, who is that vehicle? And then Mairead emerged. Yeah. And she is like in many ways in a much more precarious position than Sean, you know. Her mother has difficulty with the old drink and all that kind of thing, and she's kind of homeless and all that. So she almost in my mind became this figure of authority on him. Yeah. That she was almost advanced. She's assimilated into a world that isn't the world they come from. She's gone to Queen's. She's become part of the kind of cultured, bourgeois, writerly, poet, arty crowd, you know? All those generalizations. But she has assimilated into it, and her behaviour shifts when she's in that group. And Sean sees this very clearly. He sort of sees how she performs and how her actions change. And I guess he is answerable to her in some way. He feels that she has some degree of authority that he doesn't. Yeah. He also distrusts that. I think he distrusts her performance in a way that I didn't, but he sort of is savvy and can see clearly through it. But she is also a figure of authority who challenges him and challenges him to come to his own truth. Because he's committed this crime, he's assaulted this guy pretty badly, you know.
Yeah. He didn't mean it.
He didn't mean it. But it's part of the process of him sort of understanding, coming to terms, or maybe coming to terms with himself of what he did. There was another point I wanted to make about that, but I've lost it. But I think that she is that sort of, she's almost pulling him along with her and giving him sort of like a spiritual guide in some sort of loose way,
I think that's one of the things that happens in England or Scotland or Northern Ireland or here, that families can produce one who goes and gets an education and the rest stay home. Now, this could happen in Liverpool or Manchester, or Edinburgh, or Glasgow, where every time you go home, you have to change your sound of your voice. But then you can enter into the arty crowd, almost carrying this as a badge, almost. And we feel that Sean is on the cusp of arriving in a world where he's now going to have to try and explain away his brother Anto, or explain away, in a way, his own background. But it's also, there's a sense that he carries it with him in a way more confidently. He's like, it would be so easy to have written a novel about denying it, about staying in England and pretending all that Belfast world wasn't Sean's. But bringing him home, and he's integrated. He isn't ashamed of it. He's in it. He's living in it. He's actually enjoying some of it. Sure. So therefore, that easy drama you could make between, guy leaves home, gets an education, starts to worry about what are his friends going to think of his family. That's too easy a disconnection to make, isn't it?
Yeah, and I guess it's because upon returning, he sort of falls back in with the crowd, the boys, who he sort of left behind. And these boys are these young men whose livelihoods have been upended in all sorts of ways. Who were tradesmen, left school at 16, wanted to go and become brickies, joiners, plasters, or whatever it is they were. And then the crash happens and everything sort of changes for them existentially, because their aspirations were very much fixed. And then suddenly they have nothing. The only option they're left with is to leave to Australia, and it takes money to do that, or they get a job in a bar or behind a checkout counter. And I think that's the big thing. But in terms of how Sean adjusts and the sort of various class indicators that he's sort of masking in different circumstances, like he's going for a job interview in an art studio, and he knows almost immediately as soon as he steps in there that he's absolutely not going to get it. He's just like, he's wearing a Primark suit. He's fucked. He's just like, but the tension and because he has ambition and he wants to go to that place, it's at what cost to himself, and what does that create in his sort of sense of self? That performance and the cost of that performance of changing who you are depending on who you're interacting with has a profound effect on the individual, I think, and on Sean.
Yeah.
Sorry, the people around him don't know this, I guess, is the thing,
And then there's the question of Facebook that actually you can almost find anybody in some way if you keep tracing. So that just if you just take us through thinking, like, how do you deal in a novel now with a missing father? There was a time where you could just have him missing, or you could have a glimpse of him, but that's no longer possible because of the changes in technology. So you're in a new world. Yeah,
you can't be estranged from anybody now, in a way. It's like you can usually find them, and Sean finds his father. He's been estranged from for a long time, and I think that is a line in the book. I think I did say that. Yeah. And I think that those sequences were actually they were always the ones that I've had trouble with, because I think about how you move into a scene, how you sort of find the angle, or the key to opening it. And it was hard to transition from being fixed in space and time to not being. Yeah. And how do you do that?
Yeah, but I was interested in the fact that that, for example, he could be down and out. Hi. He could be found in some terrible place in Liverpool or Manchester or London, and you could go and find him destitute, deciding not to do that.
Yeah. He finds them online, I guess. And
and finds that he's doing okay.
He's doing well.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great... because he sees that his father is actually quite well off in some way, and also that he discovers he has a younger sibling. And this sort of makes him double think everything that he presumed to know about where his father was. And also to see that his sibling has a life that he doesn't, a very different kind of mode of existence. She dances. She goes to an academy. She's well educated. He is too, but in a very different sort of way. She's afforded opportunities that maybe most people around him weren't.
Yeah. She's also a sort of ghost, isn't she?
She is a ghost, yeah. As is his father, you know, and the book is in many ways haunted by these two figures. And there's always this sort of conversation you have to have with yourself about memory and how memory functions within the narrative and how you use that, because you can't overdo it, you know. And that's the kind of how do you and for me it is always about how you get into it and then pull out, and that's
I'm interested in this idea that you make him that he's doing okay and that the daughter is going to these classes, but there's it must have been tempting to have made him any number of cliches, an exile. Just think of the number of things.
Oh yeah.
But what I'm asking, I suppose, is did you ever have that and take it out one night, or
there was things about his father's past, about him, of course, being in the area and being on the run. That was part of the story. At least his father was on the run even before he was born, I think was the thing. But there was, and there was something in him taking up the clay pigeon shooting as a sport, and something about the gun and the countryside that sort of spoke to this otherness, this other placelessness, that's only sort of indicated through the green and the fields and that kind of thing. And in a way like that, his memories that he has for his father are memories of longing in a lot of ways, and they're complicated by that. There's this sequence where his father's showing him how to shoot the gun, and they're very close together. And there's a strange intimacy about him holding this gun while they're targeting. I think they may be trying to shoot a rabbit or something. I can't remember. But and that sort of allowed that space, to be able to do that. But no, there was a degree of stripping back in that way, that the father had almost like leave an imprint on his consciousness. And social media then had to sort of bring it to life in a way that was quite destabilizing for him. To be able just to go on his phone at any point of the day and look at his father, who he hasn't seen in 10 years, is such a strange thing to think, and to know that he's still living a life that is by all accounts quite normal, but also quite privileged or nice, and to not be able to go there and to be terrified of going there, is the...
Take me through the building of the mother.
Okay.
Your building of the mother in the novel, like what the options were, and how...
She sort of came out like one of the characters in this, because she is like, and I'll hold my hands up and admit she is based on my mother. Her story is loosely my mother's story in all sorts of ways. So there was like this very much, I sort of took her and thought, this is the space she's going to occupy in this. And it sort of, and it was, there was questions that I was sort of asking myself ethically, should I go to places in my mother's life that she might not be comfortable with, because there are instances in the book where the mother does things or has done things in her past that might be difficult for my own mother to be confronted with. But she became sort of part of so during the process of writing the book, I was speaking to her a lot about her past and her life and having conversations with her about that. And that's something we've done since I was very young. She was a single mother and sort of raised 3 boys on her own. And she always felt this responsibility towards telling us about the experience she lived through as a young woman during the Troubles. She was born in 1963, so she was maybe 9 or 10, whenever 6 or 7, whenever it kicked off, and grew up in West Belfast, And I knew that I was writing a book that was about a young man who was in some way inheriting this trauma, I guess. And there was no other figure that I thought would work perfectly than that. And it was almost like I didn't feel like I had to make that up.
Yeah.
And so she sort of formed through that.
Right.
And her painting and her artistic leanings and stuff like that were all kind of things that I drew on. So that was a kind of natural thing and felt natural, because Sean was almost like a kind of version of myself in all sorts of ways, So that was
So that as you were writing the book, you would go and talk to her. Well, was it ever the case that she told you something so great, it was exactly what you were looking for that day, you went home straight from her? I mean, is this possible that you went home straight from her, and just, like, let's get it down before she changes, or not before she changes her mind, but I mean, before, before we need to go any further.
It was kind of all of that. I mean, that's the thing. Like, I mean, it's a kind of extraordinary thing to have lived through, Like, she was 17. Like, the year Bobby Sands died, my mother fell pregnant at 17 and got married because she had to, because she was a Catholic, and you couldn't possibly not. And that for me, and she knew Bobby, she knew John, they grew up in the same estate. She's still friends with Bobby's brother, John. So there's this kind of sort of connections. And she'll often, there was like things that were happening where she was telling me things just about, going to school and walking to school with his wee lad, and then finding out a few years later that he had been shot dead, and this kind of what that meant to her to have a young guy who walked her to school every day, who sat beside her in class, who knocked her door one day and asked her to hide guns for the IRA. And she went, okay, and took them. And then what happened? The house got raided down the street. And that then just presented itself, very naturally to me. And I thought, well, what's the point in trying to make that up when it is so sort of, and that's the bit she's uncomfortable with, to be fair to her. But there, and I think that was one of the processes of writing the book, was how do you manage that within the space of fiction?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are earlier versions of that in Irish fiction, aren't there? Especially in the early fiction of Brian Moore.
For sure.
I don't know if those books matter to you. I think is it The Emperor of Ice Cream?
Emperor of Ice Cream, for sure. Yeah.
Really is a novel by Brian Moore where he really does deal with his father. It's his father rather than his mother, I think. But it's a much more Oedipal sort of, like he really wants to.
As far as I remember,
what a grumpy old fellow his father was, and then he covers the Blitz. In that book, where Brian Moore himself, as a 20-year-old, I think, or as an 18-year-old, actually worked in the morgue in Belfast with the Blitz, and that's actually in the book. But it's what happens to the father in the book that is half invented. See, the problem is once you start moving away from the truth, it's very hard to get things right, because there's something. I was going to say there's something truthful and solid about the truth, but I mean that if you try to make, just say, if I tried to make my mother into a teacher, but my father was a teacher, I would start getting things wrong immediately emotionally. Similarly with the Brian Moore figure, his father was a doctor and he worked day and night during the Blitz. He really was, but in the novel he doesn't. Because there's something funny about that. So I mean, I think what you're saying is really interesting, and it's a sort of lesson to anyone who's writing that often go close in, and that will actually bring you. I mean, people get much more, family members get much more offended, I think, if you make something up. You think, people think I did that.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
I never did that. And you go, oh, sorry, I should have just left it, what you actually did. But I mean, so that in this case, you're saying that actually by following that, you were actually able to get something. Which if you'd started to make her into an efficient secretary in some place downtown, and like it just wouldn't have done.
For sure, and I think because it was like that sort of, you're writing about this, it's very important to remember where Sean is at in terms of like being born when he was at the tail end of something that my parent lived through very directly for 30 years. He lived on the Falls, this. What does that mean? And I guess that was also my only. My experience of that and the effect that it had on her, and by turns the effect it had on me, was the only sort of resource I could go into. Was like, and it didn't make sense for me to try and fuck around with that.
Yeah. I mean, I think what also happens in the book is that you're very, very careful not to deal with the politics in any way that gives them any sort of precedence. That it isn't as though you're saying, oh, and the SDLP, if only they had, if only, and in fact, the INLA could, like, what the book deals with is character. And you place the characters in a certain moment, which is an aftermath moment, where all the scars are there. but you concentrate so deeply on the way character functions. For example, Anto is all sorts of ambiguities. You can't pin him down as to, he's wild and he's self-destructive, but there are other things, but there's great tendernesses in him too.
Yeah.
And but even the venues, the posh bar, the downtown bar, and then the old place where people can go to really get smashed. That all of that is really ways of showing character and letting character work. And the main character, of course, is the voice of Sean. But all around, you're dealing with mother, with brother, with father, with friends, with girlfriend. So all those elements are there. But while the Belfast is present, I mean, it's not your interest. You're not that interested in the actual politics or even in the history. You're interested in actually the souls, the actual inner, the interior life of several people. So to that extent, you really, this novel is a good defense of the novel form itself. And it almost tells us more about aftermath than any number of sociologists, historians, or political scientists could.
For sure. I hope so.
I mean, there's a question again. Yeah. The question is, do you agree with that? But I mean,
yes.
Sorry, Mike. I'm sorry. But I mean, sorry. There is a question that as you were doing this study, this PhD, which I think for all of us, none of us. Does anyone else have a PhD in creative writing in this room? But that as you were doing that work on the PhD, were you thinking about these matters as to what responsibilities a novelist has in a situation like that, A, to real characters, or B, to an actual socio-political background?
Yeah, I think there was two sort of things happening, because I knew, like, for most of my writing life, which hasn't been that long, okay, but for this 10 years, say from 15 years since I've been to university, I knew that I wanted to write fiction. I knew that was my interest, characters interacting with each other, and sort of interrogating different relationships and how they function, and love, and all of those sort of universal ideas of how people interact or get on with each other. And I think what happened when I went to university and was exposed then to this sort of intellectual rigor of it at PhD level was that I was reading sociological texts, and I was trying to acquire a lens through which to interpret the world. Do you know? So I pre that, I had I could write a sentence maybe on a good day, but I couldn't understand human relations in the way that a sort of intellectual kind of rigor afforded me. And I sort of thought very conceptually in that way, that I had these sort of theories in my head about class, about how class structures a person's life, how barriers prevent people in all sorts of ways from particular social backgrounds, particularly when they're poor, particularly when they have a single parent, or. And so these were all kind of there, sort of forming the kind of underpinnings. Yeah. And then it was a case of kind of just pulling that out and leaving the characters and have that there in the back of my head in different ways,
Yeah.
And it sort of it sort of unlocked something in how I saw them as social agents in some way, And I guess the Troubles and the sort of legacy of the Troubles worked in the same way, and that I was always thinking about, so Sean's taking drugs with his mates and partying late at night, but the question in my mind was why? Why are they doing this to themselves? Why are they going for 2, 3, 4 days in a row and just completely destroying their bodies, and destroying their minds in all sorts of ways? And it was essentially just to feel, to feel something, and they also allow themselves the space to open up and speak. And the only realms they could do that in is that. And so it was always a question of like, why? Because at the end of the day, he's surrounded by people who are all in different ways sort of affected by different things. But they are people, I guess. And it was, like affording them the dignity of people and allowing them the space to breathe in that way, Yeah.
But in the meantime, you're going back to Paris and... No, but I don't mean that in any cynical way, but I mean that you're going back to Paris and you're going to write this new novel.
Yep.
And are you still working on the screenplay?
I'm still writing on the screenplay.
Well, just on behalf of everyone, I wish you luck with all those things. And thank you very much for this.